Hi, I'm Ems, aka on Deck and Wings, and my main army for 40k, which I like to paint up, is Lamenter Spacemarines because I am a masochist. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you the step-by-steps of how I paint Lamenters up, starting out with the yellow. Before I start the steps of painting this model on the camera, I've already primed this model, and yellow is all about building a solid foundation. I primed this with white, and then I used a base colour of Skrag brown mixed with the Yriel yellow. You want about 70% Yriel yellow and about 30% Skrag brown, but that's completely up to you how you do that mixture. And then I've just put a coat of Yriel yellow over the top of that. I know not everybody likes using airbrushes, but I personally do when it comes to painting yellow. It just makes things a lot easier and quicker to do. The first step I'm going to be showing you on camera is adding the first layer of shadows. So I'm going to be using Deathclaw Brown from Citadel. I like to decanter those into dropper bottles and use a thinning medium. I do that for quite a lot of my Citadel paints. And then I've deposited some of that onto a wet palette. I want this to be quite like a glaze consistency. I know a lot of people cringe at glazes, but all you need to do is make it like a wash consistency, so add quite a bit of water so it has a bit of a translucent look to it, and then dab the excess off onto a piece of tissue so you've not got too much on your brush and it won't get too messy. So I'm adding this glaze to the bottom third roughly of each panel. Don't necessarily have to do every single panel if it's too time consuming for you, but that's what I'm aiming for. Glazes can be super helpful once you get your head around them, and like I said, you might want to just aim for a wash consistency when you're first getting started out with them. And make sure you do dab the excess off on a paper towel first of all. You want to get maximum control of the paint that comes off your brush. I prefer working with Deathclaw Brown as it's more muted and desaturated compared to just using orange. I find orange can be a bit too intense. So like I said, I'm trying to get as many panels as I can and shading the bottom third as well as in between the fingertips. Think of a glaze as more of a wash that goes over the top of the model. It tints it rather than it going just into the recesses. It tints those colours which you've already put on. It's best to wait for one layer to dry, and then you can put an additional layer over the top, especially in areas where you want to have the colour a bit darker. And if you do make any mistakes, so say if you think you've put too much of it in one area, wait for it to dry and then go back over the top with some of that Yriel yellow. And as an additional step, if you want it to look a bit more neater and cohesive, you can glaze some Yriel yellow back over the top. Now I'm going to be glazing the colours together. You don't necessarily have to do this step, but it just makes things look a bit neater. Start off with the colour to the one which is opposite of your brush, and then brush it into the colour which is on your brush. Moving on to doing some panel lining, so I'm just doing the deepest recesses of the model, and I'm using Doombull Brown for this. I've thinned this down a bit, like I said, test it on the back of your nail, and I'm not having it as thin as those other colours were, but I've thinned it down with a bit of water, and I've dabbed it off with some tissue so I've got more control. I'm aiming for those little grooves around the model. Again, you don't have to do every single one of these, but try and do the most prominent ones. If your paint's thin, like I've made it, it'll make it easier to flow into these recesses. It's just about patience and practice with this. And if you do mess up this process and it becomes unneat, I'll be showing you how to correct that in a minute. Since I'm working with yellow, it can be a bit more trickier to correct, and this is just a step which helps you anyway if you make mistakes. So here I've just put a blob of paint onto the model. The easiest thing to do is to dab it off with your finger whilst it's still wet. Otherwise, get a clean brush with water on and dab it over the area so that paint becomes moist and you can wipe it away then. You can also use a wet wipe on that area. And it just makes it a lot easier to make corrections afterwards if you need to paint over the top of that. Next step is to add the highlights. So for a chunky highlight, I'm using Radiant Yellow from AK Interactive. You can use Flashgitz yellow, just any like bright cold yellow. Try and use the edge of your brush to go around the edges of the model. It just makes things a bit neater. And like I said, this is going to be a chunkier highlight, so I've gone over a little bit of the top of the panels as well. Once again, this is just about control and being neat. It's just about practice, and if you make any mistakes, just correct them as I showed you earlier on. And this is one of the reasons I really enjoy painting yellow, because you have warm yellows and cold yellows, so you have a lot of range of colour to work with. You don't necessarily have to go over every single panel on the model if you don't want to. For the last part of the yellow, I use Ice Yellow from AK Interactive. Dorn Yellow is also great for this. I like to personally mix a bit of the previous colour, so that Radiant Yellow, into this. I'm going over where the previous highlights were, and I'm not going over as many areas. I still want that previous yellow to show through. So like the tips of the fingers and the edges of the face and the panels of the shoulder pads and things like that. I haven't added a lot of water to this colour, just enough that it flows. You can use something called a flow aid additive to help you with this process. It's not the same as like a thinning medium or a lamium medium. It's more to make the paint flow off your brush easier rather than to just thin it down, and it can help you out a lot with like panel lining. And that's the yellow finished off. I'm moving on to the more difficult part now. So this is going to be the shoulder pads with the checker patterns on. I base coat this area in sky grey, so anything that's like an off-white colour will help you with this. I personally don't just do the shoulder pad, I sometimes do the knee pads and other parts in the model, but you can just stick to the shoulder pad if you want to. And to help you with this or any other freehand, if you want to sketch it out first of all with a pencil, it can really help you out to have a guideline. A thin pencil like a H1's great because you'll leave less marks on the model. You can buy pre-done 3D printed and custom shoulder pads if you're not up to doing some freehand, but it does help you, and it's a skill set not just for the Lamenters but for other miniatures. Here I've started to block in where the checkers are, so I'm using black paint, it doesn't matter what brand, and I've just added a little bit of water to this and dabbed the excess off on a tissue paper. And I'm just trying to be as precise and as neat as I can. You can always make corrections afterwards. It's just all about practice and control. Once I'm happy with that, I add a heart to the center. So just any red paint, bright red paint, and then I just freely sketch on a heart, but you can always draw this on first if you struggle with it. And you can leave the logo like this, or you can be a little bit fancier, which I'm showing you here. So take a darker red and just put it on the bottom third of the heart, just to add a bit more depth to it. And if you want to be even fancier, you can actually highlight the checker patterns if you, once again, a masochist like I am. So I've got a field grey here. It's very similar to Thunderhawk blue. You don't need to add a lot of water to this, just a bit to the paint, dab the excess off once again. And then I'm just going over some of the edges around the black checkered areas. I'm going with this colour instead of grey because it just adds a bit of contrast against the orange and yellows of the armour. You can also highlight the white areas, so because I've used an off grey, we can highlight this with pure white or an off-white colour, And you can just see the contrast here. So if I'd have just put white down first, I wouldn't have been able to do this. But because I put that grey colour down first, you can add that highlight and that contrast. And it just makes things look a bit fancier and more detailed. Again, you don't have to do these steps. It's just some extra steps to make it look fancier and a bit nicer. So that's the emblem done. And now I'm moving on to the weapons. So I'm going to block this in with a rubber black colour. So this is like an off black, like a charcoal. Now if you're worried about getting paint on the yellow areas, you can just put some masking tape around where the weapon is so you don't accidentally put the black paint there. I'm not doing though because I'm showing off. And I'm just going over the weapon and also the areas which are going to be silver later on. And then I'm going to be highlighting the weapon, so I'm mixing that field grey with some black paint, so that rubber black. I'm making this more like a glaze consistency, so I'm adding a lot more water than I did to that base layer. And you might not be able to see the contrast, but if you look up close to the model, you will be able to. And it just adds a base foundation for some highlight. I'm adding this to about 2/3 of the model, going around the edges. I'm building up the contrast and the shape of the weapon. After this, I went back over just purely with that field grey. I'm not using as much as I did the previous colour, and I'm just going over the edges. So this is like a chunky highlight. This paint isn't as thin as I did previously. There isn't like an exact science to this, so don't worry too much about how I'm thinning things differently and the consistency and flow. Just get the colours down right and thin your paints. For the last highlight, I am mixing a pale blue with the field grey. And I'm adding some highlights. So once again, this paint isn't super thin. I've just added a bit of water. I'm not edge highlighting every spot, and I'm just going over where I've previously painted. I'm using blue because it contrasts nicely with the yellow and the orange. You don't always have to use greys to highlight black. You can use loads of different colours. Blues work really nicely, and also like dark greens and like greenish greys and bluish greys as well. I'm really proud of this weapon. I think it looks really neat and it contrasts nicely with the rest of the model. As I said before, you don't have to follow every single step, so you don't have to go back over and edge highlight once again. It's completely up to yourself. You can just kind of do this with hero characters if you want to. I then primed the metallic areas in a mix of silver and black as a foundation. And then I'm going to add some highlights with some graphite from Darkstar Molten Metal. So you can use lead belcher or whatever other like mid-tone silver that you want to. But I really like Darkstar Molten Metals. And I'm going about over 2/3 of the areas. Still keeping that like dark black silver colour showing through in the deepest areas. Lastly, I added some additional highlights. I'm using silver from Darkstar Molten Metals, so this would be like a Stormhold or Stormcloak silver, whatever it's called. So a very bright silvery colour. I'm going over the previous areas, but not all over. Just some slight highlights, so we still have the previous colours showing through. So we have some contrast between the light and the dark. And then for the very last bit, I like to use blue on the lenses. So I'm using Ray Gun Glow from Tooth and Coats. And just thin this paint down a little bit with water. Don't have too much on your brush. You can be a bit fancier with this if you want to, if you look up some tutorials on how to paint lenses, but I'm not going to do this in this video. I just wanted to give you an outline, mainly on painting the yellow armour, the weapons and the checkered pattern. And that's the miniature finished off. For any of the red areas, I just use red paint with a black wash. The list of paints I've used will be in the description below, along with links to my social media and my Patreon. As always, remember to enjoy your hobbies for yourself, and at the end of the day, they're just war dollies. I will catch you in the next one.